which demonstrates almost iconically the profound affinity among all works of art worthy of the name. But, reacting against the hyper-simplification of the Anglo-Saxon schools, Greimas and the École de Paris, after having identified in the poem, as the fundamental level, four actants, subject, object, sender, and receiver, and having stressed the actorialization implicit in the anthroponyms owl, girl, chest of drawers, and mother, went on to identify two narrative programs. The first F, S1 right-pointing arrow, S1 intersection OV, degree, in which the owls fornicate with the value object girl, and the second F, S2 right-pointing arrow, S1 union OV, in which the mother separates the owls from their object of value. In the course of the first program, given a semiotic square on the order of the girl, who does not know what the owls are doing to her, seems to play and not play, and is the victim of the owls' lie, while the owls find themselves as the addressees, destinataires, of a secret, they make love but do not seem, and pretend to play doctor with the girl. In the course of the second narrative program, the mother discovers the truth and identifies the seeming with the being of the owls. To skip over the intermediary passages of the gripping Grimasian analysis, at its conclusion the author discovers that the profound oppositions of the poem can be depicted on the square as follows. But, and here lies the punctum dolens of this otherwise extremely acute study, Greimas in the end no longer knows what to do with the chest of drawers and decides to donate it to the Salvation Army. The limits of this essay prevent us from considering countless other critical contributions to the fascinating problem of the owls. For the moment we will end by citing the recent essay of Emanuele Severino in which, with a lucid sense of destiny and with far greater pregnancy and depth than are usually found in the application of the weary methods of every structuralism or formalism, the owls exercising their dominion over the doctor's daughter are seen as the very essence and the vocation of the West. Only the arrival of the mother thwarts the owl's will to power, so she can be seen as a negation of the nihilism of the essence of the West, a reference to the second corsair, and the will of destiny. But to accept this, the owls must necessarily understand that only by renouncing dominion over the world can they comprehend the falsehood of the second utterance, according to which it cannot be true that it is not true that being is nothingness. What is willed is impossible, and the sense of truth is eternally what cannot now or ever succeed in being. Thus the initial Ambaraba and the final Ambaraba confirm, as scansion of an eternal return, the nothingness of becoming as the eruption of the unheard of. And the mother only makes evident how predictable the unpredictable was for those who had and cherished a desire to anticipate, ante-capere, pre-capture the owls and their defeat. Whence, as at the beginning, always and again Ambaraba. The whole is unchangeable. The chronicler of this critical adventure would like, if he might, to stop at this point, for chronicle is not tautology of the factual, but interrogation and drift. The supreme condition, interrogative arrest, remains that of going forward, and proceeding to return to the origin, and saying not to say, and not saying to be and to remain in the identity of the different. To the point where, the owls have spoken for us, or we for them, and or the language for all, or silence for the word. No voice will be able to remain silent in the full ineffability of its own void. This, and only this, is what poetry demands of us. 1982. Editorial revision. These days, especially in the United States, implacable copy editors demand of authors not only stylistic revisions but even changes in plot, new endings, whatever commercial necessity dictates. But when we Italians recall, for example, the summary way the novelist editor Elio Vittorini dealt with young writers some decades ago, can we honestly say that they ordered things so differently in the past? Take the usually overlooked fact that the first version of a well-known poem by Philip Larkin originally went, "They do you harm, your father and mother." It was only the insistence of Larkin's editor that inspired the now famous variant. And the first draft of Eliot's Wasteland opened, "April is the cruelest month." And March isn't all that great, either. Weakened in its impact by this peevish insistence on climatic details, the earlier text denied April any implied link with the rites of vegetation. As everyone knows, Ariosto at first submitted to his publisher a very brief poem that went, "Of women and knights, arms, loves, courtly rituals, and bold ventures I have nothing to say." And that was that. How about developing it a bit? The editor suggested. And Messer Ludovico, who was having enough trouble as civil governor of a remote Tuscan province, said, "What's the use? There are dozens of epics of chivalry already. Leave it. I want to urge poets to try new genres." And the editor replied, "Yes, of course, I understand, and, personally, I agree with you. But why not try approaching the form from another angle? With irony, for instance. Anyway, we can't sell a one-page book, particularly one with only 2 verses on the page. It looks like imitation Mallarmé. It would have to be a limited, numbered edition. So unless we can get Philip Morris to sponsor it, we're screwed." The Manzoni case is important. He began the first version of his novel with, "That stretch of Lake Garda." It seems simple enough, but if he had stuck to that lake, he might have written the whole history of the Venetian Republic and never got beyond Riva. You can imagine how long it would have taken Renzo to get to Milan. He'd never have made it in time for the bread riot. And afterwards nothing significant would have happened to the poor youth. Lucia would have sought protection from the nun of Rovereto, an abbess of impeccable behavior. The whole novel would have ended after a few trivial mishaps before the happy wedding. Even Brother Cottfile has more exciting adventures. The Leopardi story is still more serious. The wandering shepherd of Asia, in the first draft, cried, "What are you doing, Jupiter, in heaven? Tell me, what are you doing, silent Jupiter?" Nothing wrong with that excellent planet, of course, but it is visible only during certain seasons and has hardly any emotional or metaphysical connotations. In fact, Leopardi's composition consisted of just a few verses, at the end of which the shepherd concluded that, as far as he was concerned, Jupiter didn't amount to much. Luckily, the editor's intervention saved the day. "Professor Leopardi, give me a break. Use the old imagination. Why not try one of Jupiter's satellites?" "Oh, please, that would only make things worse. What would a wandering shepherd of Asia know about satellites? Maybe the moon, at most." "You want me to have him cry out to the moon? Really, I do have some self-respect." "Well, you never know. Run it through the machine." The Proust story, finally, is tragic. In the first version he had written, "Longtemps je me suis couché après minuit." You know what happens to a growing boy who stays up till all hours. The narrator succumbed to a cerebral inflammation that virtually destroyed his memory. He saw the Duchess de Guermantes the next day and asked, "Who are you, madam?" He was banished from all the salons of Paris, because certain faux pas are beyond forgiveness in that world. In this version, the narrator was even incapable of expressing himself in the first person, and La Recherche boiled down to a brief case history à la Charcot. On the other hand, after I ended a novel of mine with the verse of Bernard de Morlaix beginning, "Stat Rosa Pristina Nomini," I was informed by some philologists that certain other extant manuscripts read, on the contrary, "Stat Roma," which, for that matter, would make more sense because the preceding verses refer to the disappearance of Babylon. What would have happened if I had in consequence entitled my novel The Name of Rome? I would have had a preface by John Paul II, who no doubt would have made me a papal count. Or someone would have made a movie with Sean Connery in a toga. 1990. Sequels. In 1991, the Italian novelist Laura Grimaldi wrote a Monsieur Bovary, recounting what happened to Charles after Emma's death. And at about the same time, a Miss Ripley, probably a character invented by Patricia Highsmith, made A Killing with Her Scarlet, a continuation of Gone with the Wind. For that matter, from Oedipus at Colonus to 20 years after, the tradition of the sequel has earned a certain nobility. Giampaolo Proni, with his The Case of the Asia Computer, showed that he knows how to invent narrating machines, and he suggested that I offer some other possible continuations of famous novels. Marcel Hou, Proust's narrator, having concluded his work with the seal of time, exhausted by asthma, decides to visit a celebrated allergy specialist on the French Riviera and travels there by motorcar. An inexperienced driver, he is involved in a frightful accident, severe concussion, almost total loss of memory. He is treated by Alexander Luria, who advises him to develop the technique of the interior monologue. Since the narrator no longer has a store of memories to monologue about and can barely assimilate his present perceptions, Luria suggests he extend the interior monologues in Joyce's Ulysses. The narrator struggles through the unbearable novel, and reconstructs a fictitious ego for himself, beginning with the memory of his grandmother's visits to him in boarding school at Clongowes Wood. He regains a fine synesthetic ability, and the slightest whiff of mutton fat from a shepherd's pie brings to his mind the trees of Phoenix Park and the spire of the church at Chapelizod. He dies, a Guinness addict, in a doorway on Eccles Street. Molly. Waking from a troubled sleep on the morning of June 17, 1904, Molly Bloom goes down to the kitchen and finds Stephen Dedalus there, making himself some coffee. Leopold has gone out on one of his vague business errands. Perhaps he has deliberately left the two alone. Molly's face is puffy from sleep, but Stephen is immediately fascinated, seeing her as a kind of wondrous whalewoman. He recites some cheap poems to her and Molly falls into his arms. They run away together to Pula, on the Istrian coast, and then to Trieste, with Bloom pursuing them the whole time, disguised as the man in the Macintosh. In Trieste, Italo Svevo advises Stephen to write down his story, and Molly, who is very ambitious, chimes in. Over the years, Stephen writes a monumental novel, Telemachus. When he has completed the last page, he abandons the manuscript on his desk and elopes with Sylvia Beach. Molly discovers the manuscript, reads it, and becomes completely engrossed in it, finding herself back at the exact point where everything started, stirring restlessly in her bed in Dublin, on the night between June 16 and 17, 1904. Crazed with rage, she follows Stephen to Paris. At the door of Shakespeare and Company, Rue de l'Odeon, she offs him with 3 pistol shots, shouting, "Yes, yes, yes." She then takes flight, accidentally entering a comic strip by Daniele Panabarco, where she discovers Bloom in her bed making love with, simultaneously, Anne Olivia Pluribel, Lennon, Sam Spade, and Barbara Walters. Distraught, she kills herself. Sam again. Vienna, 1950. 20 years have passed, but Sam Spade is still determined to get hold of the Maltese Falcon. His current connection is Harry Lime, and the two of them are confabulating at the top of the Prater's Ferris wheel. "I've found a clue," Lime says. Descending, they head for the Café Mozart, where, in one corner, a black musician is playing as time goes by on a zither. At the little table in the rear, a cigarette in the corner of his mouth, which is wearing a bitter smile, there is Rick. Among the documents Ugarte showed him, he has found a clue. He shows Sam Spade a photograph of Ugarte. Cairo, the private eye murmurs. When I knew him he went by the name of Peter Lorre, Lime says with a sneer. Rick continues. In Paris, which he entered in triumph with de Gaulle and his forces, he learned of the existence of an American spy, whom the OSS had released from San Quentin in order to set him on the trail of the Falcon. The word then was that he had killed Victor Laszlo in Lisbon. He should be arriving any minute. The door opens and a woman appears. Ilsa, cries Rick. Brigid, cries Sam Spade. Anna Schmidt, cries Lime. Ms. Scarlet. The black man cries, turning that gray color that blacks turn when they blanch, you're back. Don't hurt Massa. The woman has an enigmatic smile. I am as you desire me. And as for the Falcon. Yes, the others all cry, in one voice. As for the Falcon, the fascinating adventuress replies, it wasn't a falcon. It was a hawk. Screwed. Spade murmurs, and for the second time. He clenches his jaw, making his profile all the more sharp. Give me back that $100, Harry Lime says. You never get anything right. A cognac, Rick orders, ashen. From the end of the bar the form of the man in the Macintosh emerges, a sarcastic smile playing about his lips. It is Captain Renault. Come, Molly, he says to the woman. The Duxième Bureau men are waiting for us at Cambrai. 1982. How to use suspension points. In How to Recognize a Porn Movie, we will see that to distinguish a pornographic film from a film that merely depicts erotic events, it is sufficient to discover whether to go from one place to another by car. The characters take more time than the spectator would like or the story would require. A similar scientific criterion can be applied to distinguish the professional writer from the Sunday, or non-writer, who can still be famous. This is the use of suspension points in the middle of a sentence. Writers use suspension points only at the end of a sentence, to indicate that more could be written on the subject, and this point could be further elaborated, or, in the middle of a sentence or between two sentences, to underline the fragmentary nature of a quotation, friends. I come to bury Caesar. Non-writers use these dots to crave indulgence for a rhetorical figure that they consider perhaps too bold. He was raging like a bull. A writer is someone determined to extend language beyond its boundaries, and he therefore assumes full responsibility for a metaphor, even a daring one. The moving waters at their priest-like task, of pure ablution round Earth's human shores. Everyone agrees that Keats has allowed his fancy to soar, but at least he makes no apology for that. The non-writer, on the other hand, would have written, the moving waters at their priest-like task, of pure ablution. As if to say, don't mind me, I'm only joking. A writer writes for writers, a non-writer writes for his next-door neighbor or for the manager of the local bank branch, and he fears, often mistakenly, that they would not understand or, in any case, would not forgive his boldness. He uses the dots as a visa. He wants to make a revolution, but with police permission. The following little list of variations may serve to indicate the ghastliness of these dots, suggesting what might have happened to literature if our writers had lacked self-confidence. A. Rose by any other name. Never send to know, for whom the bell tolls. A man's a man for a that. Call me Ishmael. The widow Douglas, she took me for her son, and allowed she would civilize me. Who's afraid of Virginia Woolf? April is the cruelest month. I am a camera with its shutter open. And so, down to River Run, past Eve and Adams. Not that it matters if the great would have looked foolish. But, as you see, these dots, suggesting the writer's fear of using bold, figured speech, can also be used to suggest his suspicion that the rhetorical figure, by itself, will seem literal and flat. An example. The Communist Manifesto of 1848 begins, as everyone knows, with the words, a specter is haunting Europe, and you must admit this is a great incipit. It would still be pretty good if Marx and Engels had written, a specter is haunting Europe. They would merely have suggested, perhaps, that communism might not be such a terrible and elusive thing, and the Russian Revolution might have taken place 50 years earlier, maybe with the Tsar's consent, and Mazzini would have taken part in it, too. But what if they had written, a specter is haunting Europe? Is there some doubt about its haunting? Is it stable? Or do specters, per se, appear and disappear in a flash, suddenly, with no real time for haunting? But that isn't all. What if they had written, a specter is haunting Europe? Would they have implied that they were really exaggerating, that the specter at most might be haunting Trier, and people everywhere else needn't worry? Or would they be suggesting that the specter of communism was already haunting also the Americas and, who could say, maybe even Australia? To be or not to be, that is the question. To be or not to be, that is the question. To be or not to be, that is the question. You can see how much work Shakespearean scholarship would have to do, plumbing the bard's meanings. All men are created equal. 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 All men are created equally entitled to use suspension points. 1991. How to write an introduction. The purpose of this article is to explain how you put together the introduction to a book of essays, a philosophical treatise, or a collection of scientific articles, to be published, ideally, by a university press or its equivalent, all in accordance with the rules long established in the academic world. In the paragraphs that follow I will clarify, as succinctly as possible, why an introduction must be written, what it must comprise, and how to list the acknowledgments, for skill in making acknowledgments is the hallmark of the thoroughbred scholar. It can sometimes happen that a scholar, his task completed, discovers that he has no one to thank. Never mind, he will invent some debts. Research without indebtedness is suspect, and somebody must always, somehow, be thanked. In preparing this article, one have drawn on a long and invaluable familiarity with scholarly publications. These have been brought to my attention by the Ministry of Public Education of the Italian Republic, the Universities of Turin and Florence, the Polytechnic Institute of Milan, and the University of Bologna, as well as New York University, Yale University, and Columbia University. I could not have completed this work without the patient and impeccable collaboration of Signora Sabina, thanks to whom my study, which by 2 a.m. is reduced to an undefined mass of cigarette stubs and waste paper, every morning is found in acceptable condition once more. My special thanks also to Barbara, Simona, and Gabriella, whose efforts have saved my hours of reflection from the importune interruption of transatlantic calls inviting me to conferences on the most disparate subjects, alike only in being remote from my personal interests. This article would not have been possible without the unfailing assistance of my wife, who, always ready with the reassurance that all is vanity, was, and is, able to tolerate the moods and demands of a scholar constantly obsessed by the major problems of existence. Her devotion in offering me apple juice, successfully passing it off as the most refined Scotch malt, has been an immeasurable and incredible contribution, documented by the fact that these pages have retained a minimum of lucidity. My children have been a source of great comfort to me and have provided me with the affection, the energy, and the confidence to complete my self-imposed task. Thanks to their complete, Olympian detachment from my work, I have found the strength to conclude this article after a daily struggle with the definition of the intellectual's role in a postmodern society. I am indebted to them for inspiring an unshakable determination to withdraw into my study and write these pages, rather than encounter in the hall their best friends, whose hairdresser follows aesthetic criteria that revolt my sensibilities. The publication of this text has been made possible by the generosity and the economic support of Carlo Caracciolo, Leo Rubini, Eugenio Scaffari, Livio Zanetti, Marco Benedetto, and the other members of the board of directors of the publishing firm of L'Espresso. My special thanks to the business manager, Milvia Fiorani, whose continuing monthly assistance has allowed my research to go forward. That countless readers will hold this modest contribution in their hands is due to the director of the distributing services, Guido Ferrantelli. Creation and revision of this text have been encouraged by Olivetti, which provided me with an M21 computer. I would like to express my gratitude for the MicroPro and its WordStar 2000 program as well. The text has been printed on an Okidata Microline 182. I could not have made the lines above and below available to the English language audience without the affectionate, constant insistence and encouragement of Grace Budd, Otello Venturovich, Michael Candle, Martha Brown, and Dr. Ferdinando Adornato, who have sustained me with heartwarming and pressing daily telephone calls, informing me that the presses were rolling and, that at all costs, I had to provide the final footnotes. Obviously, they are in no way accountable for the scholarly content of what appears on these pages. Any defects in the present article, as in those of the past and the future, are my responsibility alone. 1987. How to write an introduction to an art catalog. The following notes are meant to assist writers of introductions to art catalogs, hereafter referred to as WIAC. But first a word of warning. These instructions are not valid for the writing of a critical historical essay to be published in a scholarly review. There are numerous, complex reasons for this distinction, the first of which is that critical essays are read and judged by other critics and only rarely by the analyzed artist, who either does not subscribe to the publication or has been dead for 2 centuries. A catalog for a show of contemporary art exists in quite a different context. How does one become a WIAC? Unfortunately, the process is all too easy. You have only to be involved in some intellectual profession, nuclear physicists and molecular biologists are in great demand, have a listed telephone number, and enjoy a certain fame. Fame is calculated in this fashion. It must have a geographical extension superior to the impact area of the show. Fame should be at state level for a city of less than 70,000 inhabitants, at national level for a state capital, at worldwide level for the capital city of an independent nation, San Marino and Andorra excepted, and must be of a depth inferior to that of the cultural knowledge of possible purchasers of pictures. If the show features wooded landscapes in the style of Daubigny, it is not necessary, indeed, it is counterproductive, for the writer to be a contributor to the New York Review of Books. It would be more advisable for him to be the principal of the local teachers' college. Naturally, you must be invited by the exhibiting artist, but this is not a problem. Exhibiting artists far outnumber potential WIACs. Given these conditions, your engagement as WIAC is inevitable, quite independent of your will. If the artist has made up his mind, the potential WIAC cannot escape the task, unless he decides to emigrate to another continent. Now, when the WIAC has accepted, he can decide on one of the following motivations. 1. Corruption. Very rare, for, as we shall see, there are motivations that cost the artist less. 2. Sexual reward. 3. Friendship, in either of its 2 versions. Genuine affection or inability to refuse. 4. Gift of a work by the artist. This motive is not the same as the following one, namely admiration for the artist. In fact, it is possible to want gifts of pictures in order to accumulate a commercially viable stock. 5. sincere admiration for the artist's work. 6. Desire to link one's own name with the name of the artist. A splendid investment for young intellectuals, since the artist will go to great pains to publicize the WIAC's name in bibliographies for innumerable later catalogs, both nationally and abroad. 7. Ideological, aesthetic, or commercial association, to promote a political movement or assist an idealistic art gallery. The latter raises a delicate question, which even the most resolutely altruistic WIAC cannot evade. In fact, literary, film, or theater critics, whether they praise or demolish the work they criticize, have fairly little effect on its fate. The literary critic, with a favorable review, may increase a novel's sales by a few hundred copies. The movie critic can pan a cheap porno comedy without preventing it from taking in vast sums at the box office, and the same observation applies to the drama critic. The WIAC, on the other hand, contributes to the enhancement of all the artist's work, occasionally causing its value to jump by a factor of 10. This special position also affects the critical situation of the WIAC. While the literary critic can speak ill of an author he may or may not know, but who as a rule cannot control the appearance of the article in a given paper, the artist commissions and controls his catalog. Even when he says to the WIAC, "Feel free to be severe," the situation is, in point of fact, untenable. Either you refuse, but as we have seen, this is impossible, or you are, at the very least, polite. Or evasive. This is why, since the WIAC wants to maintain his dignity and his friendship with the artist, evasiveness is the essential element in art catalogs. Let us examine an imaginary situation. We'll take the painter Proskatini, who for 30 years has been painting ochre backgrounds with, in their center, a superimposed blue isosceles triangle, its base parallel to the southern edge of the painting. Over it is a red scalene triangle, tilted to the southeast with respect to the base of the blue triangle. The WIAC must bear in mind the fact that, depending on the period in the painter's development, the artist will have entitled his painting, in this order from 1950 to 1980. Composition, 2 plus infinity, minimal, make love not war, Watergate, a feat snobs, a, cross, miss, reading, pictorially correct. What, honorable, possibilities does the WIAC have in writing his contribution? If he's a poet, it's easy. He dedicates a poem to Proskatini. For example, like an arrow, cruel Zeno, the flash of another dart, parasang traced, on a cosmos infected, with black holes of every color. This solution creates new prestige, for the WIAC, for Proskatini, for the dealer, for the purchaser. The second solution is for writers of fiction only, and it takes the form of a freewheeling open letter. Dear Proskatini, when I look at your triangles, I am once more at Ukbar, with Jorge Luis. A Pierre Menard who suggests forms recreated in another era, a Don Pythagoras de la Mancha. Lust at 180 degrees, can we rid ourselves of necessity? It was a June morning, in the sun-baked countryside, a partisan hanged from a telegraph pole. In adolescence, I doubted the substance of the rule, etc. If the WIAC has a scientific background, his task is much easier. He can begin with the conviction, correct, as it happens, that a picture, too, is an element of reality. Then all he has to do is talk about the profundities of reality and, no matter what he says, he will not be lying. For example, Proskatini's triangles are graphs. Propositional functions of concrete topologies. Knots. How to proceed from knot U to another knot. As everyone knows, an evaluating function f is required, and if, for every other knot v does not equal u considered, f, u, appears less than or equal to f, v. It is necessary to develop u, in the sense of generating knots that descend from u. A perfect function of evaluation will then fulfill the condition f, u, less than or equal to f, v, so that d, u, q, is then inferior or equal to d, v, q, where, obviously, d, a, b, is the distance between a and b in the graph. Art is mathematics. This is what Proskatini is telling us. At first sight, this tactic might seem to work well for an abstract painting but not for a Morandi or a Norman Rockwell. Wrong. Naturally, everything depends on the skill of the man of science. As a generic indication, we would say that, today, adopting, with a fair amount of metaphorical nonchalance, René Thorn's theory of catastrophes, we can demonstrate that Morandi's still lifes represent forms on that extreme edge of equilibrium beyond which the natural forms of the bottles would become cusps beyond and against themselves, cracking like a crystal injured by an ultrasonic sound. Thus the painter's magic consists in the very fact of having depicted this extreme situation. The writer could also play with the meaning of the words, still, i.e., for a temporal extension, but until when? Magic of the difference between still living and living on. Another possibility existed from 1968 until, roughly, 1972, the political interpretation. Observations on the class struggle, on the corruption of objects tainted by their commodification. Art as rebellion against the world of consumer goods, the triangles of Proskatini as forms that refuse to become trade values, open to working class inventiveness, expropriated by capitalistic greed. The return to a golden age, announcement of a utopia. All that has been said so far, however, applies only to the WIAC, who is not a professional art critic. The art critic's situation is, shall we say, more critical. he must somehow talk about the work, but without expressing any value judgments. The easiest solution is to show that the artist has worked in harmony with the dominant view of the world or, as we say now, the influent metaphysic. Any sort of metaphysic represents a way of accounting for what is. A picture undoubtedly belongs in the category of things that are and, moreover, no matter how bad it may be, it somehow represents that which is, even an abstract painting represents that which could be, or that which is in the universe of pure forms. If, for example, the influent metaphysic sustains that everything that is nothing but energy, to say that Proskatini's painting is energy and depicts energy is not a lie. At worst, it is obvious, but obvious in a way that saves the critic, while making Proskatini happy, not to mention his dealer, and the possible purchaser. The problem is to identify that influent metaphysic of which, because of its popularity at a given time, everybody has heard. To be sure, you can join Berkeley as asserting that ses percipi and say that Proskatini's works are because they are perceived. But as the metaphysic in question is not particularly influent, both Proskatini and the readers of the catalogue would perceive the excessive obviousness of the statement. Therefore, if Proskatini's triangles had had to be described in the late 50s, exploiting the Sartre-Merleau-Ponty influence, and, above all, the teachings of Husserl, it would have been suitable to define the triangles in question as the representation of the very act of intending, which, setting up eidetic regions, turns those same pure forms of geometry into a modality of the Lebenswelt. In that period, too, as variations were permissible also in terms of the psychology of form, to say that Proskatini's triangles have a gestaltic pregnancy would have been unassailable. Every triangle, if it is recognizable as a triangle, has a gestaltic pregnancy. In the 60s, Proskatini would have seemed more a la page if in his triangles a structure homologous to Levi-Strauss's parental patterns could be discerned. Desiring to play with structuralism in 68, the WIAC could have said that, according to Mao's theory of contradiction, which subsumes the Hegelian triad in the binary principles of yin and yang, the two triangles of Proskatini evidence the rapport between primary contradiction and secondary contradiction. It must not be thought that the structuralist module could not also be applied to Morandi, deep bottle as opposed to surface bottle. After the 60s, the critics' options became freer. Naturally, the blue triangle intersected by the red triangle is the epiphany of a desire in pursuit of another with which it can never identify itself. Proskatini is the painter of difference, or rather of difference within identity. Difference within identity is also found in the heads, tails relationship of 100 lira coin, but Proskatini's triangles would lend themselves also to pinpointing a case of implosion as, for that matter, would the paintings of Pollock or the introduction of suppositories into the anal tract, black holes. In Proskatini's triangles, however, there is also the reciprocal cancellation of use value and exchange value. With an astute reference to difference in the smile of the Mona Lisa, which, seen obliquely, can be recognized as a vulva, and is in any case Bayon's, Proskatini's triangles, with their reciprocal cancellation and catastrophic rotation, could appear as an implosiveness of the phallus that becomes cogged vagina. The phallus of fallacy. In other words, to conclude, the golden rule for the WIAC is to describe the work as such a way that the description, besides being applicable to other pictures, can be applied also to the emotional experience of looking in a delicatessen window. If the WIAC writes, in Proskatini's paintings perception of forms is never inert reception of sense data. Proskatini tells us that there is no perception without interpretation and work, and the passage from the felt to the perceived is activity, praxis, being in the world is construction of Abschattungen cut deliberately in the very flesh of the thing in itself. The reader recognizes Proskatini's truth because it corresponds to the mechanisms through which he distinguishes, in the deli, a slice of bologna from the macaroni salad. Which establishes, in addition to a criterion of viability and efficacy, also a criterion of morality. It is enough to tell the truth. Naturally, truth comes in all sizes. 1980. Appendix. The following text was actually written, by me, to introduce the painting of Antonio Fomes in accordance with the rules of postmodern quotation, cf. Antonio Fomes, From Ruopolo to Me, Studio Annunciata, Milan, 1982. To give the reader, for concept of, reader, cf. D. Coast. 3 concepts of the reader and their contribution to a theory of literary texts, Orbis Literarum 34, 1880, W. Iser. Der Akt des Lesens, München, 1972. Der implies it lesser, München, 1976, U. Eco. Lector in Fabula, Milano, 1979, G. Prince, Introduction à l'étude du narrateur, Poétique 14, 1973, M. Najgard, Le Lecteur et la Critique, Degrés 21, 1980, Some Creative Intuitions, cf. B. Croce, Estetica cum Scienza del, Espressione e Linguistica Generale, Bari, 1902, H. Bergson, Œuvres, Edition du Centenaire, Paris, 1963, E. Husserl, Ideen zu einer Phänomenologie und Phänomenologischen Philosophie, Den Haag, 1950, About the Painting, for the concept of painting, cf. Senino Senini, Trattato della Pittura, Valori, vid d'artisti, Vasari, Levit, P. Barocchi, ed. Trattati d'arte del Cinquecento, Bari, 1960, Lomaso, Trattato dell'arte della pittura. Alberti, della pittura. Armanini, de. Vari procedi della pittura. Baldanucci, Vocabolario toscano dell'arte del disegno. S. van Hoogstraten, Inleiding tot de Huge Sibole der Schilderkunst, 1678, 8, 1, pp. 279 et seq. El Dolce, Dialogo della pittura. Zuccari, Idea de pittori, of Antonio Fomes, cf. For a General Bibliography, G. Pedicini, Fomes, Milan, 1980, and in particular, greater than, I should essay an analysis, cf. H. Putnam, The Analytic and the Synthetic, in Mind, Language, and Reality 2, London and Cambridge, 1975. M. White, ed. The Age of Analysis, New York, 1955, in a form. Cf. W. Kohler, Gestalt Psychology, New York, 1947. P. Guillaume, La Psychologie de la Forme, Paris, 1937. That is absolutely innocent and unbiased. Cf. J. Piaget, La Représentation du Monde chez l'Enfant, Paris, 1955. G. Caniza, Grammatica del Vedere, Bologna, 1981. But this is a thing. For the thing in itself, cf. I. Kant, Kritik der reinen Vernunft, 1781–1787. That is very difficult in this world, cf. Aristotle, Metaphysics, of the Postmodern, cf. 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 Closing parenthesis closing parenthesis closing parenthesis closing parenthesis closing parenthesis dot. Hence I will do nothing, cf. Sartre, Lettres et la Néant, Paris, 1943. The rest is silence, Wittgenstein, Tractatus, 7. Sorry, maybe some other, cf. Lacan, Écrits, Paris, 1966, Time. Cf. J. B. Priestley, Time and the Conways, London, 1937. J. Hilton, Lost Horizon, London, 1933. How to set the record straight. Letter to the editor. Dear Sir, with reference to the article by Vero Verity entitled, Ide's murder suspect denies all, in yesterday's issue, I would like to set the record straight about several matters. First of all, it is not true that I was present at the assassination of Julius Caesar. As you can see for yourself from the enclosed birth certificate, I was born in Molfetta on March 15, 1944, many centuries, therefore, after the unfortunate event, which, for that matter, I have always deplored. Hence your Ms. O'Verity must have misunderstood when I told her that, with a few friends, I always celebrate the anniversary of March 15, my birthday. Further, it is similarly incorrect to quote me as saying later to a certain Brutus, we will meet at Philippi, or words to that effect. I have never had any contacts with this Mr. Brutus, whose name I heard yesterday for the first time. In the course of our brief telephone interview, I did indeed tell Ms. O'Verity that I would soon be meeting the traffic commissioner, Mr. Philippi, but I mentioned this in the course of discussing the city's traffic problems. In this context, I never said I was hiring some killers to eliminate that traitor Caesar. What I said was, we'd have to be a bunch of maniacs not to take a stab at banning traffic around Caesar Plaza. Respectfully yours, Frank Talk. Vero Verity replies, nothing in Mr. Talk's letter alters the fact that Julius Caesar was assassinated on the Ides of March in 44. I can readily believe that Mr. Talk and his friends always celebrate the anniversary of March 15, 44. In fact, it was information revealing this suspect behavior that inspired my article. Mr. Talk may well have personal reasons to propose festive toasts on that date, but even he must agree that the coincidence is, at the very least, curious. He will further recall that, in the course of our long, in-depth telephone interview, he said the words, I always believe in rendering unto Caesar that which is Caesar's. A source very close to Mr. Talk, whose good reliability I have no reason to question, has assured me that what was rendered to Caesar was 23 stab wounds. I notice that throughout his letter, Mr. Talk takes care to avoid saying who finally was responsible for those wounds. As for the pathetic rectification concerning Philippi, I have before my eyes the notebook in which I wrote, beyond any question, that Mr. Talk did not say, I'll be seeing Mr. Philippi. What he said was, I will see thee at Philippi. I can similarly confirm the threats uttered against Julius Caesar. The jottings in my notebook, which I am consulting as I write, say clearly, a bunch of maniacs, stab at Caesar. Splitting hairs and mincing words cannot absolve Mr. Talk of his grave responsibilities, nor will his pathetic attempts succeed in gagging our free press. 1988. How to watch out for widows. It may be, dear writers, both male and female, that posterity is of no importance to you, but I don't believe it. Anyone, even the 16-year-old who pens a poem about the rustling forest, or the woman who keeps a lifelong diary, merely recording, dentist's appointment this morning, hopes that posterity will cherish those words. For, even if some authors actually desired oblivion, today's publishers are irrepressible in the rediscovery of forgotten minor writers, even when these never actually wrote a single line. Posterity, as we know, is voracious and easily pleased. In order to have something to write about, any writing by others will do. Therefore, O writers, you must beware of the use that posterity may make of your work. Naturally, the ideal course would be to leave lying around only the things that, in your lifetime, you had decided to publish, shredding daily any other documentation, including third galleys. But, as we also know, keeping notes as you work is necessary, and death can arrive unexpectedly. When it does, the first risk is that unpublished material will be published, and will reveal that you were a perfect idiot. And if everyone reads the notes written in the notebook the day before you died, this risk is very strong indeed, particularly because the notes are, inevitably, out of context. In the absence of notes and notebooks, the second risk is that, immediately post-mortem, there will be an epidemic of conferences about your work. Every writer wants to be remembered in essays, doctoral dissertations, critical editions, but these things take time and cash. The immediate conference achieves two results. First, it inspires hordes of friends, admirers, young people in search of fame, to scribble hasty reinterpretations, but, as we know, in such cases they dish up only the familiar gruel, confirming a stereotype. And then, in no time, readers fall out of love with writers so blatantly obvious. The third risk is that private letters will be published. Writers rarely write private letters that differ from those of ordinary mortals, unless the letters are a pretense, as in the case of Foscolo. They can write, "Send me some preparation H," or, "I love you like crazy and I thank God that you exist," which is only normal and natural, and it is pathetic that posterity should seek out these documents simply to conclude that the writer was a human being. What did you think he or she was? A flamingo? How can such misfortunes be avoided? With notes and notebooks, I would suggest leaving them in an unlikely place, while abandoning in a desk drawer a kind of buried treasure map indicating the existence of these documents but with undecipherable directions for finding them. This ensures both that the manuscripts will remain hidden and that many dissertations will be written on the Sphinx-like impenetrability of those maps. As for conferences, it might be a good idea to leave precise testamentary instructions, asking, in the name of humankind, that for every conference held within 10 years of your death, the organizers donate $20 million to UNICEF. It will be hard to raise the sum, and few will be so brazen as to go against the express wishes of the deceased. The love letter problem is more complex. For those yet to be written, it is a good idea to use the computer, thus thwarting graphologists. Sign them with affectionate nicknames, your puppy dog, fur rickens, changing names for each lover, so attribution will prove problematical. It is also advisable to include phrases that, however impassioned, are embarrassing for the addressee. "I love everything about you, even your flatulence," who will thus be dissuaded from publishing. Letters already written, especially during adolescence, are beyond revision, however. For these, the best course is to track down the recipient and write a note recalling in tranquility those bygone days, and promising that even after your death you will revisit the scene, still in the thrall of those memories. This doesn't always work, but a ghost is, after all, a ghost, and the recipient will not sleep well after that. You could also keep a fake diary, including occasional suggestions that friends and lovers had a tendency to invent and to falsify. "What a delightful liar dear Adelaide is," or, "Today Reginald showed me a fake letter from Pessoa. A really admirable job." 1990. How to organize a public library. 1. The various catalogs must be housed as far apart as possible from one another. All care must be taken to separate the catalog of books from that of periodicals, and these two from the catalog by subject. Similarly, the recent acquisitions must be kept well away from older collections. If possible, the spelling in the two catalogs, recent acquisitions and older collections, must be different. In the recent acquisitions, for example, pajama should be spelled with an A, in the older, pajama with a Y. Tchaikovsky in recent acquisitions will follow the Library of Congress system. In the older catalog the name will be spelled in the old-fashioned way, with TCH. 2. The subjects must be determined by the librarian. On their copyright pages the books must bear no indication of the subjects under which they are to be listed. 3. Call numbers should be impossible to decipher and, if possible, very complex, so that anyone filling out a call slip will never have room to include the last line of numbers and will assume they are irrelevant. Then the desk attendant will hand the slip back to him with the admonition to fill it out properly. 4. The time between request and delivery must be as long as possible. 5. Only one book should be released at a time. 6. The books distributed by the attendant after the request form has been properly submitted cannot be taken into the reference room, so the scholars must divide their working life into two fundamental aspects: reading on the one hand, and reference consultation on the other. The library must discourage, as conducive to strabismus, any crossover tendencies or attempts at the simultaneous reading of several books. 7. Insofar as possible, no photocopier should be available. If such a machine does exist, access to it must be made very time-consuming and toilsome. Fees should be higher than those in any neighborhood copy shop, and the maximum number of copied pages permitted should not exceed 2 or 3. 8. The librarian must consider the reader an enemy, a waster of time, otherwise he or she would be at work, and a potential thief. 9. The reference librarian's office must be impregnable. 10. Loans must be discouraged. 11. Interlibrary loans must be impossible or, at best, must require months. The ideal course, in any event, is to ensure the impossibility of discovering the contents of other libraries. 12. Given this policy, theft must be very easy. 13. Opening hours must coincide precisely with local office hours, determined by foresighted discussions with trade union officials and the Chamber of Commerce. Total closing on Saturday, Sunday, evenings and mealtimes goes without saying. The library's worst enemy is the employed student. Its best friend is Thomas Jefferson, someone who has a large personal library and therefore no need to visit the public library, to which he may nevertheless bequeath his books at his death. 14. It must be impossible to find any refreshment inside the library, under any circumstances, and it must also be impossible to leave the library to seek sustenance elsewhere without first returning all books in use, so that, after having a cup of coffee, the student must fill out requests for them again. 15. It must be impossible on a given day to find the book one had been using the day before. 16. It must be impossible to learn who has a book that is currently out on loan. 17. If possible, no rest rooms. 18. Ideally, the reader should be unable to enter the library. If he does actually enter, exploiting with tedious insistence a right, granted on the basis of the principles of 1789, that has nevertheless not been assimilated by the collective sensibility, he must never ever, with the exception of rapid visits to the reference shelves, be allowed access to the sanctum of the stacks. Confidential note. All staff must be affected by physical defects, as it is the duty of a public institution to offer job opportunities to handicapped citizens. The fire department is considering an extension of this rule to their ranks. In particular, the ideal librarian should limp, in order to lengthen the time devoted to receiving the call slip, descending into the basement, and returning. For personnel expected to use ladders to reach the shelves more than 8 meters above the ground, it is required that missing arms be replaced by prosthetic hooks, for security reasons. Personnel lacking both upper limbs will deliver the requested volume by gripping it in their teeth. Library regulations tend to prevent the delivery of volumes in a format larger than octavo. 1981. How to speak of animals. Central Park, the zoo. Some kids are playing near the polar bear tank. One dares the others to dive into the tank and swim alongside the bears. To force them to dive in, the challenger hides the other's clothes. The boys enter the water, splashing past a big male bear, peaceful and drowsy. They tease him, he becomes annoyed, extends a paw, and eats, or rather chomps on, 2 kids, leaving some bits lying around. The police come quickly, even the mayor arrives. There is some argument about whether or not the bear has to be killed. All admit it's not his fault. Some sensational articles appear in the press. It so happens that the boys have Hispanic names. Puerto Ricans, perhaps black, perhaps newcomers to the city, in any event accustomed to feats of daring, like all slum kids who hang out in packs. Various interpretations ensue, all fairly severe. The cynical reaction is fairly widespread, at least in conversation. Natural selection. If they were stupid enough to mess with a bear, they got what they deserved. Even when I was 5, I had enough sense not to jump into a bear tank. Social interpretation. Areas of poverty, insufficient education. Alas, the subproletariat has a tendency to act on impulse, without thinking. But, I ask you, what's all this talk about insufficient education? Even the poorest child watches TV, or has read a schoolbook in which bears devour humans and hunters therefore kill bears. At this point I began to wonder if the boys didn't venture into the pool precisely because they do watch TV and go to school. These children were probably victims of our guilty conscience, as reflected in the schools and the mass media. Human beings have always been merciless with animals, but when humans became aware of their own cruelty, they began, if not to love all animals, because, with only sporadic hesitation, they continue eating them, at least to speak well of them. As the media, the schools, public institutions in general, have to explain away so many acts performed against humans by humans, it seems finally a good idea, psychologically and ethically, to insist on the goodness of animals. We allow children of the third world to die, but we urge children of the first to respect not only butterflies and bunny rabbits but also whales, crocodiles, snakes. Mind you, this educational approach is per se correct. What is excessive is the persuasive technique chosen. To render animals worthy of rescue they are humanized, toyified. No one says they are entitled to survive even if, as a rule, they are savage and carnivorous. No, they are made respectable by becoming cuddly, comic, good-natured, benevolent, wise, and prudent. No one is more thoughtless than a lemming, more deceitful than a cat, more slobbering than a dog in August, more smelly than a piglet, more hysterical than a horse, more idiotic than a moth, more slimy than a snail, more poisonous than a viper, less imaginative than an ant, and less musically creative than a nightingale. Simply put, we must love, or, if that is downright impossible, at least respect, these and other animals for what they are. The tales of earlier times overdid the wicked wolf, the tales of today exaggerate the good wolves. We must save the whales, not because they are good, but because they are a part of nature's inventory and they contribute to the ecological equilibrium. Instead, our children are raised with whales that talk, wolves that join the Third Order of St. Francis, and, above all, an endless array of teddy bears. Advertising, cartoons, illustrated books are full of bears with hearts of gold, law-abiding, cozy, and protective. Although in fact it's insulting for a bear to be told he has a right to live because he's only a dumb but inoffensive brute. So I suspect that the poor children in Central Park died not through lack of education but through too much of it. They are the victims of our unhappy conscience. To make them forget how bad human beings are, they were taught too insistently that bears are good. instead of being told honestly what humans are and what bears are. 1987. How to play Indians. Since the future of Native American culture at present seems dire, the sole possibility for the young brave bent on improving his social position is to appear in a Western movie. To assist him in this endeavor, we offer some essential guidelines, tips on correct behavior in both war and peace situations, to help him qualify as movie Indian, thus providing as well a solution to the problem of underemployment among members of this beleaguered minority. Before attacking. 1. Never attack immediately. Make yourself visible at a distance a few days ahead of time, producing easily observed smoke signals, thus giving the stagecoach or the fort ample time to send word to the 7th Cavalry. 2. If possible, appear prominently in small groups on the surrounding hills. Set up sentinels on totally isolated peaks. 3. Leave clear traces of your progress. Hoofprints, smoldering campfires, feathers, and amulets allowing identification of tribe. Attacking the stagecoach. 4. In any attack on a stagecoach, always follow the vehicle at a short distance or, better still, ride alongside it, to facilitate your being shot. 5. Restrain your Mustangs, notoriously faster than coach horses, so you won't outstrip the vehicle. 6. Try to stop the coach single-handed, flinging yourself on the harness, so you can be whipped by the driver and then run over by the vehicle. 7. Never block the coach's advance in a large body. The driver would stop at once. Attacking an isolated farm or circle of covered wagons. 8. Never attack at night when the settlers might not be expecting you. Respect the tradition that Indians attack only in daytime. 9. Insist on making your presence known by giving the coyote cry, thus revealing your position. 10. If a white man gives the coyote cry, raise your head immediately to offer him an easy target. 11. Attack by circling the wagons, but never narrow your circle, so that you and your companions can be picked off one by one. 12. Never employ all your men in a circle, but progressively replace those that fall. 13. As you lack stirrups, manage somehow to entangle your feet in the reins, so that, when you are shot, you are dragged after your mount. 14. Use rifles, bought illegally, whose operation is unfamiliar to you. Take a considerable amount of time loading them. 15. Don't stop circling the wagons when the good guys arrive. Wait for the cavalry without riding out to confront it, then scatter at the first impact in total disorder to allow individual pursuit. 16. In preparing to attack an isolated farm, send only one man to spy on it at night. Approaching a lighted window, he must observe at length a white woman inside, until she has become aware of the Indian face pressed against the pane. Await the woman's cry and the exit of the men before attempting to escape. Attacking the fort. 17. First of all, turn the horses loose at night. Do not steal them. Encourage them to disperse over the prairie. 18. In using a ladder during the assault, climb up it one man at a time. First allow your weapon to appear, then your head, slowly, and emerge only after the white woman has indicated your presence to a marksman. Never fall forward, inside the fort, but always backward, toward the exterior. 19. In shooting from a distance, assume a clearly visible position on the top of a peak, so that you can fall forward, to be shattered on the rocks below. 20. In the event of a face-to-face confrontation, wait before taking aim. 21. In the same situation, never use a pistol, which would resolve the confrontation at once. Only naked steel. 22. In the case of a sortie on the part of the whites, never steal the weapons of the slain enemy, only his watch. Wait in wonderment, listening to its tick, until another enemy arrives. 23. On capturing an enemy, do not kill him immediately. Tie him to a stake or confine him to a tent, awaiting the new moon, by which time others will come to free him. 24. In any event, you can be certain that the enemy bugler will be killed the moment the signal of the 7th Cavalry is heard from afar. At this point the bugler inside the fort always stands up and returns the signal from the highest turret of the fort. Further instructions. 25. In the event that the Indian village is attacked, rush from the tents in total confusion. Run around every which way, trying to collect weapons previously left in places of difficult access. 26. Check the quality of the firewater being sold by the peddlers. The sulfuric acid to whiskey ratio must be 3:1. 27. In the event of a train's passing, make sure there is an Indian hunter on board and ride alongside the train brandishing rifles and emitting cries of greeting. 28. In leaping from a roof to seize a white man from behind, always hold your knife in such a way that he is not immediately wounded but is allowed to engage in hand-to-hand struggle. Wait until the white man turns around. 1975. How to recognize a porn movie. I don't know if you've ever happened to see a pornographic movie. I don't mean movies with some erotic content, a movie like Last Tango in Paris, for example, though even that, I realize, for many people might be offensive. No, what I mean is genuine porno flicks, whose true and sole aim is to stimulate the spectator's desire, from beginning to end, and in such a way that, while this desire is stimulated by scenes of various and varied copulations, the rest of the story counts for less than nothing. Magistrates are often required to decide whether a film is purely pornographic or whether it has artistic value. I am not one of those who insist that artistic value excuses everything, Sometimes true works of art have been more dangerous, to faith, to behavior, to current opinion, than works of lesser value. But I believe that consenting adults have the right to consume pornographic material, at least for want of anything better. I recognize, however, that on occasion a court must decide whether a film has been produced for the purpose of expressing certain concepts or aesthetic ideals, even through scenes that offend the accepted moral view, or whether it was made for the sole purpose of arousing the spectator's instincts. Well, there is a criterion for deciding whether a film is pornographic or not, and it is based on the calculation of wasted time. A great, universal film masterpiece, Stagecoach, takes place solely and entirely, except for the beginning, a few brief intervals, and the finale, on a stagecoach. But without this journey the film would have no meaning. Antonioni's L'Avventura is made up solely of wasted time. People come and go, talk, get lost and are found, without anything happening. This wasted time may or may not be enjoyable, but it is exactly what the film is about. A pornographic movie, in contrast, to justify the price of the ticket or the purchase of the cassette, tells us that certain people couple sexually, men with women, men with men, women with women, women with dogs or stallions. I might point out that there are no pornographic films in which men couple with mares and bitches. Why not? And this would still be alright, but it is full of wasted time. If Gilbert, in order to rape Gilbertina, has to go from Lincoln Center to Sheridan Square, the film shows you Gilbert, in his car, throughout the whole journey, stoplight by stoplight. Pornographic movies are full of people who climb into cars and drive for miles and miles, couples who waste incredible amounts of time signing in at hotel desks, gentlemen who spend many minutes in elevators before reaching their rooms, girls who sip various drinks and who fiddle interminably with laces and blouses before confessing to each other that they prefer Sappho to Don Juan. To put it simply, crudely, in porn movies, before you can see a healthy screw you have to put up with a documentary that could be sponsored by the Traffic Bureau. There are obvious reasons. A movie in which Gilbert did nothing but rape Gilbertina, front, back, and sideways, would be intolerable. Physically, for the actors, and economically, for the producer. And it would also be, psychologically, intolerable for the spectator. For the transgression to work, it must be played out against a background of normality. To depict normality is one of the most difficult things for any artist, whereas portraying deviation, crime, rape, torture, is very easy. Therefore the pornographic movie must present normality, essential if the transgression is to have interest, in the way that every spectator conceives it. Therefore, if Gilbert has to take the bus and go from A to B, we will see Gilbert taking the bus and then the bus proceeding from A to B. This often irritates the spectators, because they think they would like the unspeakable scenes to be continuous. But this is an illusion on their part. They couldn't bear a full hour and a half of unspeakable scenes. So the passages of wasted time are essential. I repeat, go into a movie theater. If, to go from A to B, the characters take longer than you would like, then the film you are seeing is pornographic. 1989. How to avoid contagious diseases. Many years ago a TV actor, who made no secret of his homosexuality, said to a youth whom he was frankly trying to seduce, "You go with women. Don't you know that can cause cancer?" The remark is still quoted around the Milan television studios, but now the time for such joking has passed. I read recently that according to the revelations of Professor Maitre, heterosexual contact is carcinogenic. High time somebody came out and said it. I would go even farther. Heterosexual contact causes death, period. Even a fool knows that it ends in procreation, and the more people are born, the more people die. With scant regard for democratic principles, the AIDS psychosis threatened to constrict the activity only of homosexuals. Now we will limit heterosexual activity as well, and all of us will once again be on the same footing. But while I would not want to foster excessive alarmism, I would still like to point out some other high-risk categories. Drama critics, intellectuals, aspiring politicians. Do not attend off-Broadway theaters in New York. It is a known fact that, for phonetic reasons, English-speaking actors spit a great deal. You have only to see them in profile, against the light, to notice this, and experimental theaters seat the spectator directly in the line of the actor's spray. If you are an elected official, have no dealings with mafiosi, or you will have to kiss the Godfather's hand. Connections with the Camorra are also not advised, in view of the blood rituals. Anyone embarking on a political career through Catholic Action membership must somehow avoid Holy Communion, as germs can be transmitted from mouth to mouth via the fingertips of the celebrant, and the risks of auricular confession are self-evident. Ordinary citizens. Swimming in an oil-polluted sea increases the risk of contagion, because the oil droplets transport particles of saliva from other swimmers, who have previously swallowed the polluted liquid and spat it out. Anyone who smokes more than 80 Gauloises a day touches, with fingers that have touched other things, the upper part of all those cigarettes, and the germs enter the respiratory channels. Avoid being fired from your job, because you then spend the day chewing your fingernails. Take care not to be kidnapped by Sardinian shepherds or by terrorists. The kidnappers as a rule use the same hood for many kidnapped victims. Never travel by train between Florence and Bologna, as terrorist explosions in the confined area of the tunnels spread organic detritus very quickly, and in such moments of confusion it is difficult to protect oneself. Avoid areas subject to bombardment by nuclear warheads. Faced with the sight of a mushroom cloud, the spectator has an instinctive tendency to put his unwashed hands to his mouth, as he murmurs, "My God." Further risk is caused by the dying who kiss crucifixes, those sentenced to death. The blade of the guillotine is seldom properly disinfected before reuse, and orphans in institutions, where the wicked nuns make each little malefactor lick the floor after tying his leg to his cot. Ethnic minorities and inhabitants of the Third World. Native Americans are severely threatened. Passing the calumet from mouth to mouth has caused, as everyone knows, the near extinction of the Indian nation. Citizens of the Middle East and of Afghanistan are exposed to the licking of camels, hence the high mortality rate in Iran and Iraq. A desaparecido runs great risk when his merciless torturers spit in his face. Cambodians and the inhabitants of Lebanese camps should avoid the blood bath, discouraged by 9 physicians out of 10. The 10th, more open-minded, is Dr. Mangale. South African blacks are exposed to infection of various kinds when the white man considers them with contempt, grimaces, and ejects saliva. Political prisoners of every color must take great care to elude the backhand slap of the police, striking their teeth after similarly touching the gums of other persons held for questioning. Members of populations subject to endemic famine must try not to swallow frequently in an attempt to allay the pangs of hunger, as their saliva, which has come into contact with the foul air of their surroundings, can contaminate their intestines. The authorities and the press, instead of printing scandalous headlines about other problems whose solution could reasonably be postponed to some future date, should devote their energies to a vigorous campaign of hygienic instruction of the sort indicated here. 1985. How to choose a remunerative profession. There are certain jobs that are much in demand and that pay very well, but they require careful preparation. For example, the job of setting up around the city those signs that indicate the way to the superhighways. Their purpose is to clear traffic from the downtown area, and also from the superhighways, as we promptly realize once we have followed them and ended up, exhausted, on the most dangerous dead-end street in the industrial suburbs. But it is not easy to put the signs in exactly the right places. A simpleton might consider placing them at a spot where the driver is confronted with a complicated choice among several streets, and where there is thus a good chance he will get lost if left unassisted. But, on the contrary, the sign must be affixed only where, since the proper route is obvious and the driver would instinctively choose it, he must be sent off in another direction. To do the job really well, the applicant should have some notion of urban planning, psychology, and the theory of games. Another very desirable job is that of writing the instructions included in, or printed on, the packaging of domestic appliances and electronic instruments. Above all, these instructions must prevent installation. The ideal model is not that of the thick manuals supplied with computers. These also achieve this aim, but at great cost to the manufacturer. The proper model is rather the folded slip of paper accompanying pharmaceuticals, products with the extra feature of having names that, while apparently scientific, have actually been devised to make obvious the nature of the product as if to ensure that its purchase embarrasses the purchaser. Prostatin, menopausin, Crabex. The instructions enclosed in the box, in contrast, succeed with a minimum of words in making incomprehensible the warnings on which our lives depend. No counterindication, except in cases of unforeseen lethal reaction to product. For domestic appliances et similia, the instructions must expound at length things so self-evident that you are tempted to skip them, thus missing the one truly essential bit of information. In order to install the PZ40, it is necessary to unwrap the packaging and remove the appliance from the box. The PZ40 can be extracted from its container only after the latter is opened. The container is opened by lifting, in opposite directions, the 2 flaps of the upper side of the box. See diagram below. Take care, during the process of opening, to keep the container in a vertical position, with the lid facing up. Otherwise the PZ40 may fall out during the operation and suffer damage. The lid to be opened is clearly marked with the words "this side up." In the event that the lid does not open at the first attempt, the consumer is advised to try a second time. Once the lid is opened, it is advisable to tear off the red strip before removing the inner, aluminum lid, otherwise the container will explode. Warning: after the PZ40 has been removed, the container can be discarded. Another job that is not to be dismissed lightly is that of compiling questionnaires, usually during the summer season, for popular weekly magazines. Between a bottle of Epsom salts and one of 20-year-old cognac, which would you choose? Would you rather spend your vacation with an 80-year-old leper or with Demi Moore? Do you prefer being sprinkled with ferocious red ants or sharing a sleeping compartment with Claudia Schiffer? If you have answered 1 to all the above questions, then you are inventive, original, brilliant, but sexually a bit frigid. If all your answers are 2 feet, then you're a rascal. In the medicine and health supplement of a leading daily, I came upon a questionnaire about sunbathing, which allowed you to choose among 3 answers for every question, A, B, and C. The A answers are interesting. If you expose your skin to the sun, how red does it get? A. Intensely. How often do you suffer from sunburn? A. Every time I go out in the sun. How would you describe your skin 48 hours after the erythema? A. Still red. Solution: if you have answered it to most questions, your skin is very sensitive and you are subject to painful sunburn. I am thinking of a questionnaire that would ask: have you often fallen out of a window? If yes, have you suffered multiple fractures? After each fall, have you been certified as permanently disabled? If your answers are A, either you're pretty stupid or your oral labyrinth is in bad shape. Don't look out the window when the usual jokester yells up from below urging you to come down and join him. 1991. The miracle of San Bartolino. Barbarians. Dante does not treat my native Alessandria with great tenderness in his De Vulgari Eloquentia, where, in recording the dialects of the Italian peninsula, he declares that the hirsute sounds emitted by our people are surely not an Italian dialect and implies they are barely acceptable as a language. All right, so we're barbarians. But this, too, is a vocation. We are not Italians, Latins, nor are we Celts. We are the descendants of Ligurian tribes, tough and hairy, and in 1856 Carlo Aval, beginning his history of Piedmont, recalled what Virgil said of those pre-Roman Italic peoples in Book 9 of the Aeneid. And what sort of people did you think to find here? Those perfumed Atridi or the double-talking Ulysses. You have come upon a people harsh from birth. Our children, barely born, are cast into the icy rivers, whose waves toughen them first, then through mountain and forests. The youth go day and night, etc. Aval says further that these barbarians were thin and undistinguished of person, having soft skin, small eyes, sparse hair, gaze filled with pride, harsh and loud voice. Thus, at first sight, they did not give an accurate indication of their exceptional strength. One woman, it is said, was seized by the pangs of birth while she was at work. Giving no sign, she went and hid behind a thorn bush. Having given birth there, she covered the infant with leaves, and returned to her tasks, and so no one noticed. But when the babe began to cry, the mother's secret was revealed. Yet, deaf to the urgings of friends and companions, she did not cease working until the master obliged her to, after giving her a wage. This episode inspired the saying, often repeated by historians, that among the Ligurians the women had the strength of men, and the men, the strength of wild beasts. This was written by Diodorus Siculus. On the field of Marengo, the hero of Alessandria is named Gagliardo. In the year 1168, Alessandria exists and yet it doesn't. That is to say, it doesn't exist under that name. It is a collection of hamlets, perhaps, a fortified settlement or castle. In the area live some peasants and perhaps some of those mercatanti, merchants, who, as Carducci was to say later, will appear to the German feudal lords as unacceptable adversaries, who, only yesterday girded their paunches with knightly steel. The Italian communes join forces against Barbarossa, forming the Lombard League, and they decide to build a new city at the confluence of the Tanaro and the Bormida, to block the advance of the invader. The people of those scattered hamlets accept the proposal, probably because they can see a number of advantages. They seem only to be concerned with their private interests, but when Barbarossa arrives, they stand fast, and Barbarossa is stopped. It is 1174, Barbarossa is pressing at the gates, Alessandria is starving, and then, the legend goes, the wily Gagliardo appears, a peasant who might be a relative of Schweck. He makes the richest men in the city give him what little wheat they can manage to collect, he gorges his cow Rosina on it, and leads her outside the walls to graze. Naturally, Barbarossa's men capture her, disembowel her, and are stunned to find her so stuffed with grain. And Gagliardo, an expert in playing dumb, tells Barbarossa that in the city there is so much wheat that they have to use it to feed the livestock. Let's go back for a moment to Carducci. Picture his army of romantics who weep at night, the Bishop of Spires who dreams of the beautiful towers of his cathedral, the paladin count of the blonde locks who now despairs of ever seeing his Thecla again, all of them depressed and oppressed by the thought of having to die at the hand of mercatanti. Then the German army strikes its tents and goes off. This is how the legend goes. In reality, the siege was bloodier. It seems that the communal militia of my city performed well on the battlefield, but the city prefers to celebrate as its hero this sly and unbloody peasant, a bit short on military talent, but guided by one radiant certitude, that everyone else was a bit more stupid than he. Po Valley Epiphanies. I know I am beginning these memoirs in a very Alessandrian spirit, but I would be unable to think up a presentation more, how shall I put it, monumental. Actually, in describing a flat city like Alessandria, I believe the monumental approach is mistaken. I prefer to proceed along more subdued lines. I will tell about some epiphanies. The epiphany, I quote Joyce, is like a sudden spiritual manifestation, either in the vulgarity of speech or of gesture or in a memorable phrase of the mind itself. A dialogue, a city clock emerging from the evening fog, a whiff of rotting cabbage, something insignificant that suddenly becomes important. These were the epiphanies Joyce recorded in his foggy Dublin. And Alessandria resembles Dublin more than it does Constantinople. It was a spring morning in 1943. The decision had been made. We were definitely going to abandon the city. Moreover, the splendid plan was to take refuge at Nizzamonferrato, where we would surely avoid the air raids. A few months later, however, caught in crossfire between fascists and partisans, I would learn to jump into ditches to duck the Sten guns' fire. Now it was early morning, and we were heading for the station, the whole family, in a hired carriage. At the point where Corso Cento Canoni opens towards the Valfrey barracks, the broad space deserted at this early hour, I thought I glimpsed, in the distance, Rossini, my elementary school classmate, and I called to him in a loud voice. It was someone else. My father was irritated. He said that, as usual, I never stopped to think, and one doesn't go around shouting, Verdini, like a lunatic. I corrected him, saying the name was Rossini, and he said that, Verdini or Bianchini, it was all the same. A few months later, when Alessandria was subjected to its first bombing, I learned that Rossini had died beneath the rubble with his mother. Epiphanies should not be explained, but in the above recollection there are at least 3 of them. First, I was scolded for having succumbed to excessive enthusiasm. Second, I had thoughtlessly uttered a name. In Alessandria, every year they put on Galindo, a pastoral Christmas story. The story takes place in Bethlehem, but the shepherds speak and debate in Alessandrian dialect. Only the Roman centurions, Saint Joseph, and the Magi speak standard Italian, and in so doing seem highly comical. Now Medoro, one of Galindo's servants, encounters the Magi and imprudently tells them the name of his master. When Galindo finds out, he flies into a rage and scolds Medoro roundly. You don't tell your own name to just anyone, and you don't thoughtlessly call somebody else by name, out in the open, where everyone can hear. An Alessandrian may talk with you for a whole day without once calling you by name, not even when he greets you. You say, ciao, or, on separating, arrivederci, never, arrivederci, Giuseppe. The third epiphany is more ambiguous. In my memory I can still see that urban space, too broad, like a jacket handed down from father to son, where that little human form stood out, too distant from our carriage. An ambiguous meeting with a friend I was never to see again. In the flat and excessive spaces of Alessandria you become lost. When the city is really deserted, early in the morning, at night, or on the Ferragosto holiday, or even any Sunday at around 1:30 p.m., the way from one place to another, in this tiny city, is always too long, and all of it is in the open, where anyone in ambush behind a corner, or in a passing carriage, might see you, invade your privacy, shout your name, ruin you forever. Alessandria is more vast than the Sahara, with faded Morgan Le Fays crossing it in every direction. This is why the people talk very little, merely exchanging rapid signals. They lose you, and themselves. This conditions relationships, hatreds as much as loves. Alessandria, as an urban entity, has no gathering points, or perhaps just one, Piazzetta della Lega, but it has dispersion points almost everywhere. For this reason you never know who's there and who isn't. I am reminded of a story that isn't Alessandrian, but could be. At the age of 20 Salvatore leaves his native town and emigrates to Australia, where he lives as an exile for 40 years. Then, at 60, having saved his money, he comes home. And as the train approaches the station, Salvatore daydreams. Will he find his old friends, the comrades of the past, in the cafe of his youth? Will they recognize him? Will they make a fuss over him, ask him with eager curiosity to tell them his adventures among the kangaroos and the aboriginals? And that girl who once? And the shopkeeper on the corner? And so on. The train pulls into the deserted station. Salvatore steps onto the platform under the blazing noonday sun. In the distance there is a hunched little man, a railway worker. Salvatore takes a better look. He recognizes that man,